Hey folks, as I was putting this video together I heard about my surrogate brother Golden Fox going through some car troubles. He made a GoFundMe explaining how he needs an engine repair and is about halfway to reaching his goal, though I think he could still use a little help. So if you have time, just click the link in the description and donate, and if you can't, then just spread awareness however you can. It would be very appreciated and I'm sure Goldie will be very grateful for your help. Thank you for listening and enjoyed the video. So this year marks the 20th anniversary of the Kingdom Hearts franchise. Yeah, it sounds crazy, doesn't it? Kingdom Hearts is already 20 years old. And after all the years we spent waiting for Kingdom Hearts 3 to come out, we already have an announcement for Kingdom Hearts 4. There's honestly a sense of surrealism to this whole thing. Like, it's unbelievable that a crossover fanfiction between Final Fantasy and Disney that only happened because two guys met in an elevator actually ended up coming this far. And as a longtime fan of the series myself, I feel it only fitting to make a special video to celebrate this occasion. At first I thought about doing a 20th anniversary review of the original game, similar to what I did for Halo, but I figured that would be too predictable, so I decided to do something different. This is going to be a ranking of every game in the series from worst to best, to get a better assessment of how much each entry in the series has to it. Now, just to make things clear, this isn't really going to be a deep dive analysis of each game in the series, as this is really just a worst to best list. It'll be more of a standard assessment of each game's strengths and weaknesses. I might do individual reviews of each game in the future if the interest sparks me, but for now this is as close to a series retrospective as it gets. I'm also gonna set a few ground rules before we start. First, I will not be counting Union Cross as that's a mobile game. And as we all know, mobile games aren't really video games. I'm also going to disclude Birth by Sleep 2.0 as it's pretty much a tech demo for Kingdom Hearts 3 and not a full game. So I feel it would be unfair to really compare it to other entries on this list since it doesn't have a lot of content to discuss. So with that said, let's find out which Kingdom Hearts games reigned supreme and which ones fell flat. On to the count up.
Melody time! Melody time!
Hey, remember Atlantica from Kingdom Hearts 2? That terrible rhythm game world built around repetitive button prompts that don't properly align with the beat of the music? You want to see an entire game based around that? No, no one wants to see that. But they did it anyway in this piece of shit called Melody of Memory. I shit you not. The moment I powered up this game and it threw me straight into a level without any sort of tutorial explaining what I have to do or what any of the different colored symbols mean is a complete summarization of the whole experience. First off, they didn't even get the right music for this game. Instead of getting the updated scores from 1.5 and 2.5 HD Remix, they decided to go for the outdated music from the PS2 versions of the games. What brainless logic is that? This game is supposed to be a celebration of the series' music, right? So why would you use a completely outdated source of music? That would be like playing the PS1 soundtrack over the PS4 remake of Final Fantasy VII. They don't even give you the option to switch between the two versions of music. I looked for it, and there is no feature like that to be found. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad if the game was actually fun to play through. It is not. I mean, when you hear about Kingdom Hearts getting a rhythm game, you're pretty much going to get what you expect. All the gameplay amounts to is pressing different buttons to match the beat of the music. It gets very old and very annoying very quickly. Now imagine doing that for 10 hours straight. Doesn't sound very interesting, does it? It might have been one thing if this was from a series that was built around rhythm like Powerappa the Rapper or that Taiko Drum arcade game. What brainless twat at Square thought that this would be a good idea for a Kingdom Hearts game? I mean, that's incredible. A series defined by real-time RPG strategy and creative hack-and-slash combat reduced to a game of elite beat agents. It's like, boom, nothing in common. Oh, but it gets even better. Don't like the idea of progressing naturally by virtue of simply completing a level without losing your health? Well, how about we throw in a terrible mission system that forces you to complete bullshit objectives? In order to advance, you have to collect these stars by completing certain tasks in each level. They grind down your progress by forcing you to do certain stuff like getting a certain score or destroying all of a certain target. And what's worse is that most of the songs force you to play them multiple times to meet the requirements. You can't even make the argument that you're being punished for playing the game badly, because these missions are in no way tied to your performance. Look at this screenshot. Notice how I finished the song with a perfect full chain. According to the game's own ranking system, I did everything right. Well, too bad, because I have to go back and replay this level because I have to defeat a certain number of a certain Heartless. What is the point? What is the purpose of making me play the same level multiple times just to meet these requirements? Why is this god-awful mission system even in the game at all? There is literally no reason for this except the fuckwits who made this game just wanted to waste your time. And the gimmicks they add to the gameplay don't do anything to help matters. They're obviously trying to be different from other rhythm games to feel unique, but all it does is make the gameplay more annoying. Gathering the green music notes by gliding is annoying due to slippery controls and making the touch box for the notes too small. And by making it into a battle with enemies, it overcrowds the screen and abstracts your view, making button prompts confusing. There's all these flashing symbols with too many Heartless and nobodies on screen at one time and not giving you enough time to react to what's coming at you. They also do this annoying thing where everyone is running up a path and the camera angle is constantly shifting around and tilting, which can make it tedious to recognize when a certain enemy or button prompt is coming up. In other rhythm games, you simply had to look out for button prompts without some sort of moving camera to make it easier to see what you had to press and when you had to press it. This game is obviously trying to have a more cinematic approach with all these curves and angles, but it just makes the gameplay crooked. Not to mention, half the time it just feels broken. Several of the songs don't fit the gameplay due to their complex composition, and half the time it doesn't properly register button prompts and practically punishes you for playing the game right. There's also horrible difficulty spikes with songs that have a faster BPM, the pointless team selection that doesn't add anything to the gameplay, missing tracks like the 13th Reflection and the data battles from KH3, the insultingly small number of boss fights, missing worlds like the 100-Acre Wood and the Pirates of the Caribbean. For God's sake, they didn't even bother to include Symphony of Sorcery. Why wouldn't you include the world based on Fantasia? It's a rhythm game centered around music. Fantasia was a groundbreaking movie centered around music. This is practically a no-brainer. Why would you not include the Fantasia world in a Kingdom Hearts game centered around music?
Stupid! You're so stupid!
But what really makes this game so offensive is how much of an obvious ripoff it is. This was yet another cash cow made by Square to make money off of Kingdom Hearts fans by advertising an extremely small snippet of the story and bundling it into an inferior game. There's only 25 minutes of actual story content in this game and the rest of it is just shitty recaps. And the thing about those 25 minutes of story-related content, it's all entirely cutscenes. There's a single 2-minute boss fight with Xehanort and the rest of it is just more cock-teasing for the next numbered Kingdom Hearts game. It's another situation where Square decided to release a watered-down midquel as a leadway to the next numbered entry in the series, a habit that should have died out with the HD Remix collections. And even the story we end up getting is horrible, with no noteworthy addition to the overall story and lore. And not to mention, for an entry in the series based around Kairi, she does absolutely nothing. It's Sora who fights Xehanort at the end of the game while she gets reduced to a disposable pawn again. After 10 hours of suffering through this horrible game, you get no worthwhile payoff for all the time you put into it. Why did this 25-minute segment need an entire other game? There is no reason why this couldn't be put into Kingdom Hearts 3 as DLC or part of a free update patch. And worse yet, it's the same price as the numbered entries in the series. $60 for 25 minutes of content that adds absolutely nothing to Kingdom Hearts. If you're one of those people who bought this game on release because you thought Kairi was going to have a badass battle with Xehanort, or because you thought they were going to progress the story in a significant way, you got scammed. Everything about Melody of Memory is awful. The story mode is awful with horrible missions forced on the player. The gameplay is awful with tedious button prompts that overcrowd the screen, making it needlessly hard to follow. The music is awful, using outdated scores instead of updated music from the HD collections. The shortage of boss fights is awful, with Square's laziness in full display by not including something like Young Xehanort or Xion. And the fact that this game throws you straight into a level without any sort of tutorial about how to play outright proves that the people who made this game could care less about their customers. And with 25 minutes of cutscenes that could have easily been added to KH3 as DLC, it's clear to anyone with more than 2 brain cells that this game was a cheap cash grab and attempt by Square to take advantage of Kingdom Hearts fans. If by some chance you own a copy of this shit, you are to throw it into the nearest garbage can because that's where it belongs, along with Amber from Invincible and Tila from Masters of the Universe Revelation.
The cards, the cards, the cards,
To say the original Kingdom Hearts was a surprise hit would be underselling it. The amount of success it garnered was not only widespread but incredibly unexpected. So of course, Square did what any company would do when they have a big moneymaker on their hands: milk it. Obviously, there was Kingdom Hearts 2, but before that happened, there was another game coming out: Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories, exclusive for the Game Boy Advance. With how popular KH had become, it did make sense for there to be a spin-off. There was just one little problem with that. It wasn't a spin-off. Chain of Memories was a direct sequel to the events of the first game, meaning you needed to play this new game in order to understand the plot of KH2. You know those jokes about how KH is the most expensive video game franchise of all time because of all the spin-offs they released on other consoles? You can blame Chain of Memories for starting that bullshit. You are now stuck having to buy another video game system in order to keep up with the series, which was obviously going to throw people off since the original KH was a PS2 exclusive. Not only was this a blatant attempt at turning the handheld entries into a cash grab while they worked on the main numbered entries, it also meant that these midquels were inevitably going to be inferior. The Game Boy Advance, Nintendo DS, and even 3DS were simply incapable of replicating the level of hardware the PS2 had, which would result in a lot of things that made the original game a beloved classic being downsized or removed entirely. And nowhere was that more obvious than with Chain of Memories. The level design is horrible, where the size and scope of each room was based purely on which map card you used. The appeal is that they're supposed to look different depending on the card, but they all amount to the exact same thing: just empty spaces with some Heartless walking around. The rooms are just barren in terms of what they really offer, especially considering the lack of detail they have. You don't get any of the grand scale or faithful recreation of classic Disney movies the first game provided. They're all just a bunch of squares with the same 1 to 3 exit points with the occasional spring or ladder. This also goes for the battlefields, as they're also nothing but empty spaces for fighting enemies. There's no real variety to them outside of just having different skins based on the floor that you were on. The only thing that comes even remotely interesting to a battleground is the final battle against Marluxia. Everything else is just some variation of a rectangle. The shopping system is horrendously awful, as your purchases amount to shitty microtransactions with no guarantee that the card packs you buy contain the cards you actually want. This can make building your deck extremely repetitive, as later levels require you to have more powerful cards. So you're stuck creating Moogle shops over and over for random card packs until you get something of value. And what makes it even worse is that they deliberately jit the cards that you get regardless of how many Moogle points you spend. Look at this bullshit. Why am I paying 500 Moogle points for a bunch of Kingdom Keys and an Oblivion with a value of less than 3? You're just being given random stuff instead of getting a reliable card pack depending on how much you spend. The story is also incredibly boring and repetitive, at least the Sora campaign. The majority of it is just banter between characters about lost memories and some mysterious new character, and nothing actually happens until you get to the last floor and it's revealed that it was a trap set by Marluxia. The Riku storyline is where things admittedly get more interesting as you get more information regarding this mysterious organization, as well as Riku going through a pretty well written redemption arc. It's just a shame that in order to get to it you have to go through Sora's story, which is mostly just a sloth to get through. Even the act of simply progressing through the castle is made into a chore, as progress is limited to what map cards you have. If you don't have the required map card, you are stuck fighting the same group of Heartless over and over until they drop the one you need. The map doesn't even properly label which key rooms are which, meaning you have to blindly guess where you have to go with no real sense of direction. Which brings us at last to the combat. Is it at least good enough to save how badly designed the rest of the game is?
Yeah, no. No. Sorry, Bear.
Now obviously, since this game was made on the Game Boy Advance, it wasn't going to have all the details of the original game's combat. This left Square with the task of recreating the combat from the ground up, which they did by turning it into a card value based system. Now on paper this does seem like an interesting concept, as it's basically a game of war converted into Kingdom Hearts. You play a set of cards, your opponent plays a set of cards, whoever has the highest number lands their attack. You can use cards to attack with your Keyblade, cast magic spells, summon allies, or use items to replenish your deck. You can also perform powerful sly attacks by combining different types of cards with different values. Having the system set in real time also allowed for more flexibility, as you don't have to wait your turn to use a certain combo and technique. It sounds like a simple but robust system. Customizing your deck for certain battles and lining up your cards in order to perform certain unique attacks makes for a smart and challenging KH game. Or you can just stuff your deck with 9 cards, making it impossible for enemies to interrupt Sora's attacks, and for boss fights just stuff 0 cards at the end of your deck to instantly interrupt their slice, making the entire number value system completely pointless and cheesing through the entire game. The card value system is painfully easy to exploit, almost to an insulting degree. Since 9 cards make it easy for you to just spam combos, and because 0 cards are the most powerful card if played second, there's nothing stopping you from just brainlessly button mashing your way through the whole thing. And this is where Chain of Memories falls flat. For all the talk of KH being a brainless button masher series, this is the entry that acts as the worst offender to that statement. Every other entry in the series had at least some sort of punishment for those who didn't play precautiously in battle. But because Chain of Memories combat is dictated by who plays the highest numbered card, you can freely mash the attack button or slide button with no danger of dying unless you are allowing yourself to get hit. Any sense of risk and reward is completely eliminated by the knowledge that you can just endlessly spam the basic 3-hit combo with a high enough set of numbers. Some may argue that it's worth learning Slice because they deal large amounts of damage, but it's a moot point after finding out Sora's attack power is linked to what Keyblade cards you use. After finding out which Keyblade cards to use in which order, you don't have to worry about combat anymore. Your basic 3-hit combo deals more damage and ends boss fights more quickly than any Slice Sora can learn, making the need to learn new attacks completely worthless. But that's not the only thing made worse by converting Kingdom Hearts into a GBA cartridge. The boss fights are painfully boring, not just because it's extremely easy to cheese them, but because their design philosophy had to be scaled down to accommodate the GBA's limited hardware. They have less attacks and mobility, making them sluggish and lacking the flair that their PS2 counterparts had. And there's no spectacle to these battles, as all the battlefields are just the same generic rectangle. The only difference between a few of these boss fights is that some of them have a platforming element, which only makes them more tedious and less fun to fight. Obtaining experience is also terribly butchered by turning it into a bunch of gems you have to run around and collect before they disappear after defeating an enemy. Instead of obtaining XP naturally, you are forced to stop fighting and aimlessly run around the battlefield to pick them up, leaving you open for enemy attacks while being distracted. What idiot at Square even thought this would be a good idea? Oh yeah, I love having to stop engaging in the combat every 10 seconds to run around and pick up jewelry. And for all the praise I give the Riku campaign for having a well-written storyline, his gameplay ends up being even worse than Sora's. Instead of being able to freely customize your deck, you had to play with a set deck that can't be changed. This might not be so bad if it wasn't for the fact that every time you enter a new floor, Riku was given a new set of cards. You were forced to memorize an entirely different deck every single time you started a new level. It slows everything to a grinding halt, and it just feels needlessly confusing. Even the party system was completely butchered by turning allies into cards that randomly appear in combat. They end up being unreliable, as most of the time they end up having very low numbers, making it really easy for enemies to break them. And you can end up picking them up by accident if you don't want to, making it difficult to shovel to the end of your deck, in case you need quick access to 0 cards and healing cards. They didn't even bother to animate more than 2 directional attack sprites for the GBA version, resulting in your attacks missing half the time since Sora and Riku are completely incapable of swinging their weapons in an angle. What else can I really say except Chain of Memories is a complete mess, and it easily stands as a top contender for one of the worst in the series. Everything that made the original Kingdom Hearts a beloved classic was completely stripped away in order to make this blatant cash grab even functional on an inferior system. The level design is hollow with no particularly interesting visuals. The Sora campaign is horribly paced with tons of repetitive dialogue, and the combat sacrifices all the groundbreaking mechanics and spectacle of its predecessor in service of a boring card value system you can just ignore, one that was extremely easy to exploit and required no actual skill to master. Even the PS2 version ends up being unimpressive, as it ends up being the exact same thing, just copying the design philosophy of the GBA version with hardly any worthwhile changes. Honestly, Chain of Memories was doomed from the start, as it was just a blatant example of Square treating KH like a cash cow for them to make money off of, not even bothering to properly inform people that it was a midquel. If you were one of those people who was following KH2 for its story, and you didn't know about Chain of Memories back in 2006, you were going to be left asking a lot of questions. I mean, more than usual.
Have you finished those errands? Have you finished those errands? Have you finished those errands?
After Kingdom Hearts 2, Organization 13 became a fan favorite for many fans of the series, so having an entire game centered around them made sense. It also had a lot of potential to be one of the most memorable entries in the series. Having an entire game where the story is centered around Roxas growing as a person while developing his bond with Axel, delving into how their friendship ended up withering over time and give us a leadway into the tragic conclusion of their story sounded like a very interesting and promising concept. Too bad that potential was completely wasted. Out of all the lesser entries in the series, Days was the one that I really wanted to like, but it just ended up falling flat in too many areas. So let's start delving into why. The story being the first and probably biggest drawback. Now, like I said before, this really isn't a bad idea for a Kingdom Hearts game, as it allows Roxas' character to be more fleshed out beyond just being some mysterious figure with a connection with Sora. Over the course of the story, he learns that there's more to life than just collecting hearts and learns how to appreciate the little things in it that make it worth living. You can see how through his interactions with Axel and Xion, he's becoming more human, which makes it all the more tragic knowing he inevitably has to lose that humanity to set up the events of KH2. It's meant to be a more character-focused narrative, with it being something of a coming-of-age story for Roxas while seeing the world of Kingdom Hearts from his point of view. There's just one problem. The game developers thought it would be more interesting to make the bulk of the cutscenes talking about retcon missions. As a result, the actual plot involving Roxas and his relationship with Axel and Xion is painfully slow. There's so much pointless padding between the stuff that's actually interesting that it feels like your interest is being held hostage. Oh sure, we'll get to the story content that you actually want to see, but first we need to have a bunch of boring banter between organization members. I guess the idea is that we're supposed to be learning more about them, but we never learn anything new or interesting about any of them. Every time the higher-ups make an appearance, they're just giving boring lectures to Roxas and treating him like dirt. That comedic exchange between Demyx and Vexen from Kingdom Hearts 3 had more character development than anything that happened to anyone in this game. Okay, so what about the actual story between Roxas, Axel, and Xion? Well, it ends up being both a hit and a miss. The friendship that builds between Roxas and Axel is genuine and well-paced, and it's actually really heartbreaking to see it end the way that it does. The stuff with Xion, however, always ended up feeling foamed in. It just feels like they were trying to come up with more motivation for Roxas when him feeling betrayed by Axel and him wanting to go in search of Sora to become his own person was enough. Roxas' story is about him looking for answers to his identity. Throwing in Xion sort of takes away from that dichotomy. It also doesn't help that Xion was created specifically for this game's plot. It ended up being erased from everyone's memory, making her existence completely pointless until they decided to arbitrarily bring her back in KH3. The story overall just feels stagnant and repetitive, as it feels like you're watching the exact same thing on loop for the entirety of the game. Roxas goes on a mission, has a quick quip with an organization member, goes to the clock tower to meet up with Axel and Xion to eat some ice cream. 10% of the time they might do something different, rinse and repeat until the final boss fight. And by the time you get to the final battle with Xion, you realize that 90% of the cutscenes we watched to get here weren't important to anything. It's just a dragged out waste of time. But at least the gameplay is good enough to make up for it, right?
Wrong.
Once again, we're in a situation where a PS2 style game had to be converted into a system with weaker hardware for the style they were going for, which results in this game being more or less a rehash of KH1, but with less variety and detail. First up is the panel system, and oh boy is it a terrible gimmick. You level up Roxas by equipping him with these panels you collect for completing missions, which is also used to equip items, magic, and abilities. It might have been one thing if it was more like the AP system, but instead they thought it would be a good idea to turn this system into a shitty game of Tetris. If you wanted to equip a new ability, you had to adjust the board based on not only how many spaces were available, but also the different shapes of the panels you equipped. It's extremely annoying that you have to do this almost every single time you complete a mission, constantly having to micromanage your panels every single time you wanted to switch weapons or give Roxas a new ability gets very irritating, and after 10 to 15 hours of it, it becomes frustrating. And what's even worse is that the panel spaces and level multipliers you needed were locked behind completing missions, including the bullshit challenge missions. So unless you're a diehard completionist, you are never going to reach your maximum potential. And then there's the mission system. Instead of progressing through the game by going through each world with a unique storyline at your own leisure, you were forced to constantly backtrack to the same location to perform shitty missions. Go here to kill some Heartless. Go here to inspect the background. Go here to collect symbols, then go back to wax some dark blobs, then go back to chase this stupid floating green thing. It's bad enough that the game forces you to backtrack for 20 hours straight, but it's made even worse by how these missions were specifically designed around wasting your time. Those stupid stealth segments where you have to go back to the beginning of an area if you get caught, collecting those stupid symbols before the ring around them disappears, running against the walls to inspect random piles of sand or scratches on the wall, those horrible Emerald Serenade chases where you have to go after a Heartless with an obnoxious amount of health that's constantly moving away from you at a speed that you can't keep up with, and worse still, they were so lazy that they literally just copy-pasted the level design from KH1 and 2. Only about 5% of the level design in this game is new, with the other 95% being recycled assets from previous games. It makes the constant backtracking even worse because there's nothing new to explore. There's no sense of freedom to any of these missions as they force you on a set path, making the game overall an extremely linear experience. Even the controls are really disjointed as a result of the DS's smaller button layout. Selecting commands is regulated to a button press instead of directional buttons, meaning the cursor only moves in one direction, making the simple act of selecting commands slow and confusing. The camera controls are also horrible as there's no second analog stick, leaving you to either interact with the touchscreen or hold a button. Oh, and don't forget having the camera centered behind you and locking onto enemies being tied to the same button, making locking onto enemies slow and annoying. Even just moving your character around feels unnatural as you're always moving in some kind of angle instead of a natural 360-degree frame. And finally, the combat is boring and repetitive. In KH1 and 2, you were able to freely modify Sora's combos with new abilities you obtained through leveling up or defeating certain bosses. Choosing which attacks he would use, customizing his moveset to your liking, and being able to perform powerful techniques you required as a reward for defeating powerful enemies was incredible. In Days, that is not the case. Your combos were limited to what weapon you gave Roxas before the start of a mission, and you were unable to switch weapons during missions. So for the entire level, you were stuck spamming the same 4-hit combo or whatever magic spells you could fit into your panel menu. The only worthwhile thing Days added to the combat system is the Limit Break. This was an ultimate attack you could perform when your health reached a certain threshold, and you couldn't activate it if you restored health past the yellow bar. So unlike KH1 and 2 that allowed you to freely spam your most powerful attacks, Days only allowed you to activate your Limit Break if you were in a critical state. It's a really clever risk and reward system that makes you actually consider whether or not you want to heal. Do you decide to play it safe and restore your health? Or do you put yourself at risk to deal lots of damage? It's a really cool idea, and it's a shame that future games didn't do anything to bring it back. But aside from that, Days is without question one of the weakest entries in the series. If I could describe it using only one word, it would be tedious. All it consists of is going to the exact same worlds to the exact same locations to complete the exact same missions, to get the exact same payoff of Roxas, Axel, and Xion going to the clock tower to eat ice cream and talk about how their day was, and just repeating that cycle over and over again until you finally decide to turn the power off and do something else. I was bored out of my mind playing this game, and there were so many instances where I just wanted to stop because it had nothing fresh or inventive to offer. For a KH game centered around Roxas, you'd think it would be one of the best entries in the series, but it's just not. Unless you're one of those die-hard fans who just really wants to play as Roxas or see some sort of midquel explaining what he was going through between Chain of Memories and 2, it's a complete waste of time.
Hello, your computer has virus.
Yeah, I was honestly as surprised as you when I came to this conclusion. Kingdom Hearts Recoded, the game infamously regarded as the worst in the series, is actually one of the more well put together midquels. I mean, okay, it's not a great game, but we'll get to that later. After the mediocre experience Days offered, you'd probably think another DS game wouldn't work. But I gotta give credit where it's due and say the people who made this game learned from the past and put forth a much better experience. For starters, the combat is actually pretty interesting. It's less sluggish than Days and flows pretty well, particularly because they added more variety to your combos. It does have the same issue of limiting them to which Keyblade Sora is using, but the added weight and new animations they give Sora make them feel actually distinct from each other, encouraging experimentation with different weapons. Unlike Days, which recycle the same attack animations, Coded gives many of the Keyblades a unique moveset, with a lot of variety to attack speed, mobility, and power. They also gave each Keyblade a unique ability tree that you can freely customize to your liking. Each Keyblade has exclusive abilities you can use to change up how Sora behaves in battle, allowing you to tailor the ability tree to certain encounters. You can choose to make Sora immune to status ailments, heal over time, sap HP when attacking enemies, or add an elemental attribute to his attacks. There's quite a fair amount of different abilities provided by the tree system, and they all feel useful, giving you an edge in combat and providing you with a set of different options for fighting enemies. They also bring back the deck command system introduced in Birth by Sleep while adding a new twist to it. This time you can combine your commands to create new attacks without needing to level them up. And the game lets you know what you'll be getting when combining abilities. Admittedly, it was annoying in Birth by Sleep that you were combining abilities without knowing exactly what you were getting out of it. So in this game you have the benefit of knowing what you're getting from the system so you don't risk wasting a command. The commands themselves are also very useful for fighting groups of enemies. They have a wide attack range and are useful tools for crowd control. The transition between basic attacks and deck commands is also very smooth, making them more flexible in a tight situation. You can freely use them for combo finishers or use them as individual attacks. And it's not just the combat that was made better. The basic controls are also vastly improved over Days in terms of how they adjusted controls to the DS's button layout. The camera is a lot better as you can freely move around while adjusting it behind you instead of being forced to stand still and hold a button. Sora's jumps also have a more floaty aspect to them, which complements the platforming focused aspect of the gameplay. Even the platforming elements that were infamous in the original game feel like they were tweaked in the right direction. Controlling Sora during jumps and dictating where he lands feels more natural and less repetitive, with several of the new level designs made appropriate for timed jumps. Even the worlds are an improvement over Days. Each one has its own unique gimmick, so you get a new experience in each level. For example, Wonderland is built around a maze puzzle which you'd think would be repetitive, but they added some things to make it fun. There's an overview camera that gives you a better perspective of your surroundings, and unlike days where you're forced to go back to the beginning of an area if you get spotted, you're given the ability to outrun the soldiers. There's even an entire level based around classic Final Fantasy turn-based combat with engaging mechanics. Playing through Olympus was so much fun with the different ways you can mess around with the turn-based formula, teaming up with party members and using items to assist you in battle. There's also these bug worlds you have to go into to proceed into a world, and they're actually pretty fun to play through. Each one has a different structure, so there's a sense of variety to how you progress through them. There's also a gambling system in place where you have to bet your GP to increase the amount of rewards you get after fixing a glitch. They're not too difficult to complete, and the payoff is really worth it for how much you can get out of it. But what's really impressive is the leveling system in the form of the stat matrix. The stat matrix is a highly expensive system that allows you to level up Sora's powers by placing chips you collect from completing tasks. You'd think it would end there, resulting in the leveling system being linear, but the game allows you to use this system to freely customize the difficulty in so many ways. You can use blank chips to keep yourself from getting too OP, you can increase the drop rate of items in exchange for making enemies stronger, you can tweak the max HP of both enemies and Sora. There's also a system that links different computers with each other, resulting in the value of your chips being doubled, further increasing Sora's stats. This is the kind of leveling system that Days should have had. One that allows you to freely modify and organize your abilities and stats without limiting your progress. With all these things put together, Coded has a surprising expansive gameplay variety, with each world having a different gimmick, a different playstyle provided with each Keyblade, and the highly customizable stat matrix combined. It's actually a pretty fun game half the time. And unfortunately, the reason I say half the time is because it still suffers from several problems. For starters, the combat ends up suffering from a really limited enemy AI. Their behavior just feels really watered down and generic compared to what you usually expect from the series. It also doesn't help that there's an extremely small variety of enemies compared to KH1 and 2. It ends up being unremarkable fighting the same enemies throughout the game, as it doesn't feel like the game is giving you enough variety to fight against. There's also the issue of recycling level design and assets from previous games. In the same way Days was lazy with its level design, Coded just takes a bunch of maps from KH1. Granted, there are a few original areas, but it's really obvious to see how rushed this game feels with the number of recycled maps. It also doesn't help that for the sake of the non-existent story, you were forced to backtrack to every single level, basically playing through the entire game a second time instead of exploring anything new. They could have at least added a few more worlds, but the lack of actual locations results in little variety in exploration. And finally, there's the non-existent story where nothing of consequence actually happens. Aside from the cutscenes just being very badly rendered sprites of the characters, everything happens to a data version of Sora, so there's no real progression in the grand scheme of things. There's some book of prophecy that ends up going nowhere, some message from Namine involving the Birth by Sleep trio, and that's pretty much it. There's no important character struggles, no noteworthy additions to the lore, and the whole thing is just paced out at a really sluggish degree. It feels like you're just going through the worlds without a long-term motivation, which results in the experience feeling sort of hollow. Maybe if Coded had a more noteworthy story, it would be remembered more fondly. And it does deserve better because it has a lot of gameplay mechanics and ideas that are fun to play around with. Playing this game again, I really didn't expect it to rank this high on the list, but it was a surprisingly fun game. At least during the parts that were fun to play. It's kinda disappointing that people only remember this for its cutscenes because otherwise, it's okay. Not good, not bad, just okay.
Just relax, lay about, or my face will put you out. Dream, 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 dream.
Okay, if I have to be really honest, I'd say Dream Drop Distance is only in the top 5 in the series by virtue of the rest of the games being either mediocre or downright awful. As much as I love the stuff in this game that really works well, there's unfortunately a lot of things that end up taking away from the overall experience. So I think it would be best to get the negatives out of the way first. First and most obvious, the ability link system, which is widely regarded as the absolute worst thing about the game. Instead of gaining abilities naturally by leveling up or defeating certain enemies, you were forced to engage with the game's horrific pet simulator. Last I checked, people didn't purchase Kingdom Hearts to give a balloon cat tummy rubs or feed treats to a demonic-looking chicken. The amount of time the game requires you to grind ability points by spending time in this shitty pet simulator in order to gain abilities that are useful and attacks that you need is incredibly insulting. And the only other option you have is wasting your time playing shitty minigames. Either way, you were forced to mingle with a terrible system that severely limits how you build Sora and Riku. And because certain abilities are made exclusive to certain spirit monsters, it's extremely difficult to organize your stats in a way that's helpful. It's a bunch of repetitive busy work that requires the player to stop playing the game for hours on end in order to progress. And I might have been more forgiving of this if it wasn't for the fact that the game is built entirely around this new shitty faction in the form of Dream Eaters. Not only are these things not explained very well in the plot, but they're also forced onto the gameplay. Instead of teaming up with iconic Disney characters like Quasimodo or Musketeer Mickey, you instead team up with Dream Eaters, who offer very little in terms of gameplay variety. They have very stagnant AI with not a whole lot separating them from each other, with their actions and behaviors amounting to the same thing. And it's not much better the other way around, as the enemy Dream Eaters offer very little in combat. Unlike the Heartless that offered a variety of unique and creative designs based on the world you were in, Dream Eaters amount to a small number of animals with a small handful of different skins. You're basically fighting a total of 25 enemy types throughout the game, but with slightly different looking attacks and color patterns. It makes the combat feel stale as there's not a lot to test your skills on. And that's not including the boss fights, which are all mediocre and forgettable. Oh, you thought you were gonna fight Frollo atop the Notre Dame Cathedral? Well, how about instead you fight this ugly looking bat thing? Twice. The Dream Eater boss fights are just very bare bones and barren in terms of mechanics with nothing interesting to accommodate them. It just amounts to mashing attack buttons and healing. A lot of them are also badly designed, like this flying crab that's constantly flying away from you and out of your attack reach, or some generic looking mole that just randomly teleports across the room, making it annoying to track down and fight. These boss battles don't have anything interesting to offer, with none of the grand scale or edge of your seat tension a boss battle is supposed to give you. The only boss fights that are any good are the ones with Xehanort's clones and Ventus's armor, and they only appear at the very end of the game. With a shortage of memorable battles and worthwhile bosses, it doesn't create a whole lot of replay value. Also, the story of this game, even when compared to lesser entries in the series, is a huge mess made even worse by the introduction of time travel. The plot is filled with constant information dumping that becomes really tiresome by the time you get to the final world. And there's a lot, and I mean a lot of exposition and recapping where they basically just re-explain stuff from previous games. So much so that there's literally a memento feature going over the plot of each game that amounts to reading walls of text. It's the same problem as Mass Effect 3, where they try to make the story accessible to people who thought about making this their first game in the series for whatever stupid reason. Xehanort's clones don't really do anything except just show up once in a while to gloat and needlessly recap previous events, and the actual plot is broken up by generic rehashes of stories from the Disney movies. They also make it needlessly confusing by playing events out of order and having them tied to these awkward flashbacks, where it makes you wonder why they couldn't just play it straightforward if you're given the option to skip cutscenes anyway. With all these issues put together, the story is just a slog to get through, and it results in the exciting parts losing their luster. And then there's the issues with the gameplay. Basic combos are noticeably slower than coded, with sluggish movements and pauses in between hits. It makes the combat feel needlessly slow and time-consuming compared to Birth by Sleep and even the original game. This problem could have been elevated if there was a significant difference between controlling Sora and Riku, and there isn't any. They're both pretty much identical to each other with the same sluggish combos, same flow motion mechanics, same stats, and same basic movements that don't do anything to separate them. The only real difference between Sora and Riku is the way they use Dream Eaters. Sora uses them for team attacks while Riku absorbs them to activate different command styles. There is some experimentation offered by the different possible combinations, but not enough to really make it stand out. And finally, there's the Dream Drive system that forces you to switch between Sora and Riku against your will. It's a highly intrusive element that needlessly cuts off your progress and confuses you when you regain control of a certain character only to be randomly thrown into a battle with no warning. It can even happen during boss fights, which if it does will fully restore their health and force you to do the whole thing over again. Who in their right mind thought this would make the game more fun? Forcing you to switch between characters regardless if you're prepared? Imagine if they did that for Birth by Sleep. That would just be terrible. Admittedly, Dream Drop Distance really messed up a lot of stuff, which can really ruin the game for a lot of people. So why did I still rank it this high on the list? Well, in spite of its problems, it also does a lot of things right. For starters, the worlds are fantastic. Of all the KH midquels, this has the absolute best worlds in terms of level design and scale. Areas are massive in scope and have a ton of free room for both combat and exploration. And not only are they huge, they also feel really faithful to the movies they're based on. This is the first game in the series since KH2 where the levels feel like they're actually bringing the movies to life and allowing you to freely interact with the set pieces straight out of the film. The design of the City of Bells alone is incredible. It really feels like you've been transported into the Hunchback of Notre Dame. The level of detail is astounding, right down to the Court of Miracles. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's a world based on Pinocchio that combines the carnival with the ocean where you look for Monstro, and it all ties together pretty well. and you can freely interact with the carnival rides and set pieces. The Musketeer world is here too, and for a straight-to-DVD movie, they put a lot of time into recreating locations from the movie. With the opera, the dungeon, the pathway leading to the Beagle Boys' hideout, even the shore on the beach where they sing "This Is the End." That's a magnificent attention to detail. Even the world that never was has a lot of interesting infrastructure and cityscapes to explore, where you can freely scale buildings and explore the interior of the castle. But the best one by far is easily Symphony of Sorcery, a world beautifully designed after Fantasia. It's bright and colorful, and has so much inspiration from the movie, with each set piece perfectly capturing the majestic nature of its film counterpart. And they also replace the usual sound effects from combat with instruments, making it feel like you've been truly transported into a musical realm. The levels in this game are so refreshing to go through because of how much love and passion was put into them. They didn't take the easy way out and just reuse maps from KH1 and 2. They put time into creating new worlds from the ground up. Of course, these worlds are a lot bigger than what you normally expect from Kingdom Hearts, so they'd have to think of a mechanic that makes traveling through them faster and more flexible. And that's what they did by introducing flow motion. This is easily one of the best things ever put into the series, giving you endless possibilities for interacting with environments and using them to navigate bigger areas. Spinning on poles, jumping off walls, scaling tall buildings, dashing across the air, skating on rails. There's a lot of fun mobility to this mechanic that adds a layer of freedom to the gameplay. It's also a pretty useful tool for combat. The weight surrounding it feels right, and it's very useful for fighting groups of enemies. It's good for both transport and crowd control, making it a must-use tool for encounters. There's also the reality shift, where you hack the environment around you to perform special attacks. Each world has a unique reality shift with different mechanics and properties. They speed up the flow of battle while expanding on the combat by introducing an element that lets you take advantage of where you're positioned. There's also a new Game Plus feature that allows you to carry over spirits, a Dream Point system that allows you to give Sora and Riku stat boost for an edge in battle, and the deck commands carried over from Birth by Sleep are still fun to use. Dream Drop Distance is one of those games that I would say is fun to play in spite of it not being that good. Admittedly, it is weaker than Coded in several areas, but it easily makes up for it by just having a lot of meaningful content to offer. Unlike Coded, this game has new worlds and new ideas, with the developers taking full advantage of all of them, making for a flawed but passable KH experience. I can see why this one may have disappointed people, as there's a lot of potential that got wasted, but the stuff that's good is really good. With all the other midquels being either generic or a complete mess, it was nice to have one that was actually halfway decent. It's not the best, but I appreciate it for what it is. But seriously, fuck that pet simulator.
When you walk away, you don't hear me say, please, oh baby, don't go.
Well, it was only a matter of time before we came to the one that started it all. The original Kingdom Hearts was a worldwide phenomenon, a game changer that broke new ground in both RPG and hack-and-slash gameplay. I'd even go so far as to say it still holds up years later as one of the greatest titles released on the PS2, with how many elements of it still hold up. The combat, for starters, is really addicting and fluid. A lot of people tend to say the combat is slow and clunky with Sora's limited mobility, and granted it can feel that way during the start. But as you level up and obtain new abilities, Sora's capabilities in combat really start to evolve. Not only do his attacks become faster to the point you can chain high number combos, but he can deal an insane amount of damage with the right equipment and abilities. It really feels like Sora is becoming stronger over the course of the game, giving the player an authentic sense of progress during later segments. And it never gets to the point that Sora becomes too powerful. The growth of your stats is done at a steady pace, so there's always a sense of balance as you advance to the next level. And the combo modifiers you obtain for leveling up offer a lot of options for you to experiment with. But what really helps Kingdom Hearts stand out is its approach to the Final Fantasy formula it's based on. Instead of making it a turn-based game, combat takes place in a real-time environment. A lot of RPGs would eventually move on to have real-time combat as opposed to turn-based, but this is the game that revolutionized the concept. It provides an element of mobility for the player, giving them the ability to properly adapt to enemy attack patterns. Learning when to block and when to dodge enemy attacks adds a level of decision-making that very few RPGs offered at the time, making for a much more robust system. You also have a number of magic techniques, each with their own properties and uses in combat. You can use elemental techniques to exploit an enemy's weakness, deal fixed damage on enemies with large HP, or use magic that increases your defense. Instead of just having magic spells that deal lots of damage, there's a real sense of variety to them, adding even more flavor to battle. You also have party members to assist you, and their AI is actually really helpful. They know when to attack, when to heal, and when to assist Sora in a critical situation. You also have the ability to customize their behavior in case you want them to reserve MP for a more defensive approach. With all these elements put together, the gameplay of the original Kingdom Hearts is a highly engaging experience. Finally, there's a set of choices you make at the beginning that drastically affect your character build. Not only in terms of stats, but which abilities you learn at which level. There's a total of 6 possible combinations, meaning you have 6 different ways to experience the game. It's a permanent decision that makes you carefully consider what to focus on and what to sacrifice. Do you exchange defense for attack, or do you exchange attack for magic? It's a really interesting addition that can create a new experience every time you play. Of course, the combat isn't the only thing that's worthy of praise. There's also the story, which I know is going to sound crazy with this being a Kingdom Hearts game, but it actually holds up just as well as the gameplay. Of all the games in the series, this one has the best narrative, with a perfect sense of pacing, character development, and learning about the world and its lore without it turning into boring exposition dumping. It has a very focused plot centered on Sora traveling to different worlds, sealing keyholes to slow down the Heartless invasion while searching for his missing friends. It's very straightforward with its development, with no pointless filler or padding disrupting its progress. And part of what makes it so much fun to watch is its highly engaging and charming cast. Sora is an appropriately upbeat protagonist who never loses his optimism and knows how to get serious when the situation calls for it. He's lovably dim-witted without being an incompetent moron and has a pretty interesting character arc about friendship. How it's important to have companions to help you out instead of doing everything by yourself. The friendship he develops with Donald and Goofy is really profound and grows naturally over the course of the game. The trio have really good comedic chemistry with creative banter while still having a believable kinship. They bicker, they argue, but they still genuinely support each other without it feeling forced. Riku and Kairi are well written too, with Riku having a very profound character struggle. He never does anything horrible or irredeemable, and his motivation to save Kairi while being an unsuspecting pawn to Maleficent are a really good setup for his redemption in the following games. And Kairi gets to have an important role in the story, taking initiative and being tied into the big twist without reducing her existence to a plot device. The blossoming romance between her and Sora is played out very steadily as they feel more like best friends than an actual romantic couple. And as we see more of them together, they have a very clear connection that goes beyond just obvious shipping fuel. They interact in a way kids their age would, poking fun at each other, cracking jokes, talking about their interests, and sharing personal moments of trust with each other. It shows how Kairi can be a very engaging character when she's allowed to be, and it's a real shame that future games didn't know what to do with her. The villains are also very well incorporated into the story. Instead of just making the Disney villains one-shot antagonists, they form a whole rogues gallery of famous villains. They all work together towards a common goal of using the Heartless to seize power while having unique interactions with both each other and the protagonists of their respective worlds. It adds a real sense of character to these villains instead of just copy-pasting their movie roles. The way the overall plot is set up is really tight and cohesive, making it feel like something that was properly planned out to make sense in spite of its ridiculous premise. Rather than just making a generic point A to point B adventure where Sora, Donald, and Goofy go sightseeing in various Disney movies, there's a sense of purpose to where they go and why they're there. And each Disney world has a unique storyline that properly ties into the primary plot instead of just rehashing storylines from the movies. And even with all that put to the side, it's just a fantastic and imaginative concept. At first glance, the idea of a crossover between Disney and Final Fantasy sounds like it would be really embarrassing. But the universe that Tetsuya Nomura created with this premise is so captivating and creative. A universe where all sorts of different worlds based on Disney movies are scattered across space, with each one faithfully designed in the image of their respective movies. You team up with a sway of Disney heroes to fight various Disney villains, interacting with dozens of Disney characters in original and creative ways, with all of their personalities feeling faithful to their film counterpart. It's practically every little kid's fantasy come to life, and the premise is handled with a lot of respect without taking itself too seriously. They even came up with creative ways to incorporate Disney movies into the game without creating worlds for them, making characters like Bambi and Dumbo summonable allies, having Winnie the Pooh take place in a book, using Merlin and Fairy Godmother as mentors to help you practice magic. There's even an entire side quest where you explore the different worlds in search of the missing 99 Dalmatian puppies. And it's a worthwhile side quest because you get all sorts of rewards for reuniting the 101 Dalmatians. I know this is probably just me being nostalgic, but it's just such an imaginative experience. An action-adventure RPG where you can freely interact with dozens of classic Disney characters and fight alongside them against the forces of evil is every little kid's dream come true. And the way the gameplay is designed makes it a really fun experience. So with all that said, you'd think this would be one of the greatest video games of all time, right? Well, no. For all the stuff that aged really well in this game, it still has several problems. Most infamously, the horrible platforming. There's a lot of badly designed and clunky areas based on time jumps and careful positioning that are not made with Sora's mobility in mind. It needlessly slows down the experience with a mechanic that isn't even the main appeal of the gameplay, and it's made even worse with worlds that are entirely based around platforming. Halloween Town, Monstro, Deep Jungle, it's a monotonous time waster that isn't fun. There's also a number of worlds that are really small in terms of scale, which results in you having little room for combat or having to constantly backtrack through the same areas over and over. The most infamous example being Deep Jungle, where the storyline requires you to backtrack to the treehouse and then back to the camp and repeat the cycle at least 3 to 4 times. The Gummy Ship mode is also really uneventful as it amounts to slowly moving from one world to another while dodging obstacles. The controls and mechanics to it are really linear with not a lot of interesting ideas to offer. Not to mention that there's a lot of horrible gimmicks that did not age well. The terrible Winnie the Pooh minigames, the terrible White Mushroom guessing game, the horrible item synthesis system, and a lot of very badly designed boss fights. Whether it's Jafar, Ursula, Oogie Boogie, the Phantom, the Trick Master, the Ice Titan, there's a huge list of bosses in this game that did not age well as they don't properly accommodate the flexibility of the combat. And for all the pros the combat has, there's also a number of things holding it back. There's a lot of instances where you encounter flying enemies that are constantly flying out of Sora's attack range. He has no way of attacking them because they're too far up. It's annoying because you're forced to wait for the enemy to get closer while being punished for the limited mobility the game sets for you. The counterattack is also really laggy, with an awkward pause that leaves you vulnerable if you end up missing, making it an unreliable tool in certain points. The guard ability is also really unreliable as the invincibility frames it offers are extremely split second and too slow to activate. It's made very apparent in boss battles that rely on your use of it like the Ice Titan, which really help to expose how slow and laggy it is. There's also the issue of swimming and flying controls from Atlantica and Neverland. They take away Sora's ability to act defensively or use certain combo modifiers and special attacks. It deliberately removes options from combat and makes the gameplay fall into really linear territory where you just mindlessly mash the attack button instead of thinking. There's more detail to these problems that would require its own video, so I really can't do it here. But even with these problems, the original Kingdom Hearts is a great game that combines inventive combat with a fun story. Even after 20 years, it's still impressive how much of it holds up with the amount of content it offers while making it engaging. Its well-crafted swordplay, expansive RPG elements, imaginative world, and simple but immersive story with well-developed characters make for a fantastic nostalgia trip. It's widely regarded as a beloved childhood classic for a reason, and a standout example for how sometimes a really stupid idea can go a long way.
We're going way back to before the beginning.
By all accounts, I really shouldn't be ranking Birth by Sleep this high on the list, specifically because it meets a number of red flags that come with the idea of a Kingdom Hearts game being on a handheld, forcing you to buy another console to keep up with the story, trying to milk more money out of Kingdom Hearts fans with yet another spin-off midquel, limited hardware incapable of replicating the PS2. Yet in spite of this, it's a surprisingly faithful follow-up to the simple formula introduced in KH1 while introducing a slew of new ideas that are actually really fun to experiment with, even having a number of improvements over KH1. This game is actually a prequel, taking place 10 years before the events of the original to clear up some confusing elements from the first 2 games. Who was Xehanort before he split himself? What was his goal? Why does Roxas look like a completely different person and nothing like Sora? How were Riku and Sora chosen to wield the Keyblade? It's the usual kind of stuff you expect from a prequel where they try to tie in these completely new characters into the story of the original to make them seem like important figures. Oh golly, Kairi was able to go inside Sora because Aqua cast a spell on her. I never would have guessed, as if I really needed to know. But in all seriousness, Birth by Sleep's strengths come from very unexpected places, specifically its approach to the combat. With the PSP's limited hardware, it's more telegraphed after KH1, which might feel off for people coming fresh off KH2. But this isn't really a bad thing as it gives the gameplay a familiar feel to it. The weight feels about right with character mobility feeling familiar to KH1. But there's a lot more to it than that. This game is most noteworthy for introducing the deck command system, which is meant to be a way for the RPG elements to be translated into smaller hardware. It's a cooldown system that replaces the MP bar, with each technique having a wait period before you can use it again, with the length of the cooldown depending on the power of the attack. What makes this system accessible is that it ensures you always have control over which ones you have and the order you use them. You can also melt commands together to create new, more powerful ones. This adds a huge level of experimentation to the game as there's dozens upon dozens of different commands to discover and choose from, with limitless possibilities to how you can customize your deck. You can strategically pick which ones you want to use and which techniques you want to prioritize. Focus on physical attacks or magic spells. It does take some time to get used to, but when you get the hang of it, it's a really rewarding experience. difference. Melding two basic attacks for a more advanced one with a % chance of getting lucky and scoring an even more powerful ultimate one makes the command melding system into something you want to do instead of it feeling forced. It's also interesting how obtaining support abilities is tied into this system. Obtaining things like Second Chance, Leaf Bracer, and Once More are tied into this system, which you can do by adding a crystal to your commands. Fortunately, the item drops are far more frequent than in KH1 and 2, so you don't have to worry about spending hours on end trying to farm these crystals. Some people might say this is a problem as it makes obtaining abilities out of your control, since it would be more reliable to obtain them from leveling up. But in actuality, this method for obtaining abilities can be really beneficial, especially if you're playing on higher difficulties. By using this method, you can obtain every available support ability before even the halfway point of the game. I still remember a playthrough where I got all the abilities I wanted before even getting to the Radiant Garden section. This also means the number of abilities you equipped isn't tied to how much AP you have. You can freely have as many as you want and even turn them off if you want to challenge yourself. The flow between standard combos and deck commands is also pretty consistent. It's similar to Coded, where you can freely use them as individual attacks or combo finishers. There are some commands that have a bit of a lag to them, making them unreliable, but thankfully they're in the minority. But what truly sells the combat is how distinct and diverse they made each of the 3 playable characters, making them completely different from each other in multiple ways. Each one specializes in a certain attribute with their own benefits and weaknesses for you to work around, which gives you the feeling of playing the game in different ways. It's a huge step up from Dream Drop Distance, where playing as different characters actually feels different. They all have their own individual weight, attack speed, flexibility, and defensive maneuvers. They also have exclusive deck commands and unique command styles, which are activated by filling the meter using different moves. Command styles are also an incredible addition to the game, as it rewards the player for experimenting with different attacks. Each one offers different movesets and finishers with different methods of attacking and dealing damage. There's even some really interesting attention to detail with some of the abilities and movesets each character is given. Several of Terra's abilities take direct inspiration from his boss battle in KH2, and Ventus actually feels like you're in control of a prototype version of Roxas. He has the reversal ability, the Faith technique, and can even imitate his Light Volley attack when using Aqua's D-Link. Speaking of D-Links, this is another new mechanic added exclusively for this game. Since the trio mostly travel by themselves, the game adds an interesting mechanic for incorporating a party member system despite not having a party, where you activate a mode exchanging your deck commands for a new set of attacks based on the character you select. Each link has special finishers and different passive abilities with unique benefits, letting you mix and choose which ones are most helpful for your preferred playstyle. Some of these abilities even help balance the gameplay by evening out a character's weaknesses, like how you can use the Ventus link to increase Terra's attack speed. All of these mechanics, when meshed together, make Birth by Sleep the most experimental entry in the franchise by far, with each of the 3 playable characters offering vastly different playstyles, the different combinations you can make with command melding, the different command styles you can activate by using different deck commands, and the different ways you can tinker with D-Links. It feels like you're always doing something new throughout each playthrough. Other improvements over KH1 include no gummy ship mode, which allow you to quickly enter a new level without being forced into a shooting gallery, and the boss fights are also much better in terms of mechanics and design. They don't have the grand scale of the PS2, but they're made with a much better understanding of your limited mobility. They have a much better build around timed dodges and blocks, and they have distinct attack patterns you can learn from. They might not stand out as some of the best in the series, but they're satisfying challenges that aren't accompanied by horrible gimmicks like many of the ones in KH1. Even the level design is much more satisfying. There can be an issue with worlds being too linear or small given the PSP's limited hardware, but they all have distinct presentations that feel faithful to the movies they're built around. Areas like Cinderella's room, the dwarf mines, the cottage, the evil queen's castle, Maleficent's lair, and the Indian camp from Neverland successfully recapture the feeling of interacting with classic Disney movies while having enough room for combat situations. There's no horrible platforming in between, and they have a reasonable scope to keep the combat from feeling cluttered. Unfortunately, this is where my praises of the game stop, as everything else feels really watered down. The main problem again is the story, and this is pretty much where things started to get needlessly complicated. Aside from the obvious continuity errors, it ends up taking away from the feats of Sora and Riku by stating how they weren't really special. Riku didn't gain access to a Keyblade because he had a strong heart, only because Terra stowed the ability upon him. And instead of Sora being naturally chosen, he only got to use a Keyblade by virtue of Ventus being inside him. Granted, this can be used to explain things like how Sora seemed to have extreme knowledge of fighting with a Keyblade despite having no training, but it still cheapens the experience and makes Sora and Riku less significant. Another problem with the story is how the drama between Aqua, Ventus, and Terra doesn't feel as rewarding as it was with the Destiny Island trio. Not because they don't have good personalities or believable character struggles, but rather because we don't see enough of their chemistry. The original game took its time to carefully craft an idea for how Sora, Riku, and Kairi had a strong bond. Every time we see these three together, they're only shown to argue, get into fights, and have doubts with each other. The only time they're not doing these things is during the prologue segment, which you're given the ability to outright skip. We don't really see enough of them together to really get a grasp of their bond in a positive light, which you could say was meant to show how piercing Xehanort's manipulation is supposed to be, but not enough happens in between to strengthen their connection with the audience. It just makes the ending of their story in this game feel mandatory as opposed to tragic. When Sora, Riku, and Kairi were separated at the end of the original game, it was a huge emotional gut punch and appropriately bittersweet ending. There was a ton of chemistry shown between the three that allowed us to better connect with them. This is what made the idea of them being separated from each other at the end of the game more tragic, while ending on an uplifting note that in time they'd find their way back to each other. But because Birth by Sleep is a prequel to the original and these three were never seen or mentioned, it makes their fates much more obvious from the get-go. The ending is all about getting them exactly where they need to be to make their absence from the story make sense. In the same way the Star Wars prequels were just a means to explain Anakin's fall to the dark side. But because the story didn't take enough time to develop a unique relationship between the three, it just amounts to, oh, so that's what happened to them. And aside from that, the pacing is just all over the place, going from rushed to stagnant to sluggish, until we finally get to that ending fight teased in KH2's secret ending. The second act in particular is extremely boring as nothing of plot significance happens in the worlds based on Hercules, Lilo and Stitch, or Peter Pan. The trio go to a Disney world, talk to a Disney character, have some kind of friendship-related revelation, and all of a sudden the Xehanort and Vanitas stuff just pops in out of nowhere. There's no meaningful character development beyond what we've already seen, so it just amounts to padding and filler. There's also a number of problems with the gameplay, with things like the command style being forced on you when activated. The mechanic itself is fun to play with, but the game doesn't give you the option for whether or not you want to activate it yourself. It takes freedom away from the player by sticking them with a combo set they didn't ask for, which can be annoying for people who don't know what commands activate which styles. Shot locks are also not handled very well, as you have to hold a button and keep the target rig over an enemy in order to activate the technique. The problem comes from how locking onto an enemy is extremely clunky. The cursor moves way too slowly and everything around you happens in real time. It leaves you open for attack since you have no way of dodging or blocking during the shot lock state, making it an unreliable tool. The enemy variety in AI is also pretty limited. The Unversed don't come in a lot of shapes and sizes like the Heartless do, and they have a really small variety of attacks. It makes the combat less eventful half the time since you're not testing your skills on a slew of creative foes. There's also the horrendously awful Mirage Arena, that acts as a poor man's replacement for the Olympus Coliseum. You fight enemies with extremely jacked up attack and defense power, making the fights drag out for a tedious amount of time. It would be one thing if this was optional, but several stat bonuses and the ultimate shot lock for each character are locked behind completing these challenges, so they're basically forced on you to reach a character's maximum potential. You'd think that would be bad enough, but there's also the fact that in order to even unlock these arena challenges, you have to complete horrible medal missions that require you to play horrible minigames and participate in tedious grinding. I outright skipped this part of the game when doing the Ventus and Aqua campaign since Terra was the only character with access to warp, and because of just how time-consuming and repetitive it is. Once was way more than enough. Also, for all my praise of the experimentation offered by the command melding, there's one major drawback for how melding works. When you get a command, you don't simply have the ability to meld it right away. You first have to level them up using command points you collect from battle. The problem is that this takes an extremely long time considering the amount of commands you need to meld to obtain stuff. There are ways around this like the command board and Stitch's D-Link, but it still feels like a draining experience to spend time farming CP when the game could just give you commands without having to level them up with endless grinding. And, with no exaggeration, this game has the absolute worst super bosses in the entire series. Now, I am aware that people on YouTube have come up with methods for cheesing these fights, but playing them straight is a damn near impossible task. They don't properly stagger when attacked, they break out of your combos at inconsistent intervals, they have jacked up defense making the act of damaging them a tedious task, they have bullshit health restoration, and their attack power is unfairly busted, taking away all of your health with a single hitter combo regardless of what difficulty you're playing on. The super bosses in previous games acted as an extra challenge for those who wanted more after completing the main story, the ultimate test of your skill and reaction time. They were interesting challenges because they pushed you to utilize everything you learned through the course of the game to its maximum potential. These super bosses are not a test of your skill, they're a test of your patience. Since the only way to beat them without the fight being needlessly dragged out is to spam certain deck commands or exploits, they amount to meaningless button mashing. It makes any sort of post-game a complete waste since there's no worthwhile reward for leveling up your characters. So Birth by Sleep ultimately falters in several places that keeps it from being the top tier game it could have been. It has a lot of good ideas and several meaningful improvements over KH1, but several ideas are also not fully realized. And the constant grinding you have to do to level up your commands is a huge chore that isn't fun. But still, it's a pretty well-made game that offers a lot in spite of its small size. There's a real satisfaction in playing through the game with 3 completely different characters, experimenting with all these command styles, trying out new skills and techniques, melding different commands to get more powerful attacks, and exploring through worlds that aren't tied to any bad platforming. There are some instances where it feels unbalanced due to changes they made, but the amount of content the game offers and dozens of different ways you can experience the combat make it a worthwhile experience. It might not be the best, but it's still a pretty good game.
This might be a good spot to find some—
Shut up!
Alright, let's rip the bandage off. There's a lot of people who like to have a bug up their ass over Osaka Team believing they ruined the franchise for not making the combat for their games the same way Tokyo Team did for KH2. With this combined with the very long 13-year wait it took for this game to finally release, Kingdom Hearts 3 was inevitably going to be a really divisive entry in the series. I have a feeling that no matter what they did with this one, a lot of people weren't going to be happy because, well, 13 years is a really long time to wait for a game to come out. And in that long stretch of time, people are going to develop expectations that may be too demanding. And I'm not saying this to White Knight Kingdom Hearts 3 from criticism. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot wrong with this game. Like, a lot wrong with it. But there's also a lot of good that came out of this one while having meaningful improvements over previous entries. For starters, the combat is excellent. Yeah, I know the combo modifiers from launch were really sluggish, a problem that has since been fixed with the free update patch. But looking past that, there's so much you can do with this one that the options and experimentation possibilities rival that of Birth by Sleep. The most notable being form changes, which act as a successor to command styles. This allows you to enter a transformation state for streaking combos successfully, with each Keyblade having a unique form. Each one offers a unique approach to combat which changes to Sora's mobility, attack power, speed, and reach. Some specialize in ranged attacks, others focus on wide combos in exchange for speed, and there's also forms that offer a huge boost in offense in exchange for guard, adding a sense of risk and reward. Each form change has a unique functionality with different movesets allowing you to practice with different tactics. And with the newly added ability to switch between 3 different Keyblades on the go, you can always assure you have the best set of tools for each encounter. Form changes act as a really good replacement for the dry forms in KH2 as they allow you to freely switch between different playstyles to your liking. And unlike the command styles from Birth by Sleep, you get to choose when these forms activate, giving you control over your preferred playstyle. Keyblades can also be upgraded throughout the game using the Forge system, so they can remain reliable during later sections. It removes a problem from KH1 and 2 where Keyblades end up becoming inferior once you obtain a Keyblade with higher stats or more beneficial abilities. With each one offering unique fighting styles and tactics, it never feels like they wear out their usefulness. Every weapon has a purpose in combat, allowing your arsenal to feel more balanced. They also implement a really interesting update to magic spells with amazing interactive effects. You can set enemies on fire and they damage over time. Blizzard creates a trail of ice for you to skate on to close on enemies, and Arrow works as a replacement for Magnet, drawing groups of enemies inward and allowing you to jump off the wind using flow motion to deliver a devastating attack from above. It makes magic a lot more intuitive as each spell has different properties that can give you an advantage. They also combine with form changes to offer different behaviors and movesets. For example, by combining the fire spell with form changes like the hammer and claws, you can bring back the spinning fire ability introduced in KH2 and use it to exploit boss battles like the good old days. Magic in this game is so much fun to play around with because it offers different ways you can interact with enemies while still remaining a useful tool in dealing damage. They also added updates to the shock lock system, making it a huge improvement over Birth by Sleep. Time slows down, making it easier for you to lock on enemies without leaving you open for attacks for too long. And it also grants the ability to use Air Step. Air Step is an amazing tool for both navigation and combat, as using it allows you to quickly close in on enemies and travel far distances. And by combining Air Step with Flow Motion, you can unleash wide area attacks knocking back groups of enemies, making it a great tool for crowd control. Speaking of crowd control, one problem people have with the game is that increased number of enemies in the battlefield makes combat repetitive due to getting attacked from too many directions at once. However, the game offers a lot of useful crowd control tactics for the player to keep fights from being overwhelming. There's the form changes, magic spells, flow motion, air stepping, shot locks, the new combo modifiers from the update patch, all of which you can use to keep groups of enemies in check. As a matter of fact, crowds of enemies in this game is actually a good thing as they perfectly complement Sora's increased arsenal. It keeps fights from being too one-sided as you still have to carefully consider which enemies to prioritize in combat, with abilities that knock groups of enemies away so you can focus on a single target. Even boss fights offer fun, satisfying challenges with identifiable attack patterns you can learn from and adapt to. Most of them aren't as iconic as the ones from 1 and 2, but mechanically they're engaging battles where you can practice different tactics. And if you still need a boost in combat, the game adds a cooking mechanic by implementing ratatouille in the game. You can travel through different worlds searching for different foods you can make into meals with the help of Little Chef. Each meal gives you a certain boost in stats, and by consuming a full course meal, you'll be granted a number of different bonus abilities. From increased XP gain to abilities like Berserk Charge, there's a fair list of beneficial abilities you can obtain from cooking. And if there's a certain meal or bonus ability you like, you can save it as a favorite for instant access provided you have the right food. And it also gives the player motivation to do exploration as certain foods can only be found in certain worlds. Speaking of exploration, they also included a hidden Mickey hunt in the form of lucky emblems. This is a really fun side quest as you get to freely travel across worlds in search of hidden Mickeys you can capture on your camera. Finding them gives you exclusive items, and unlike the puzzle pieces from KH2, they're not locked behind growth abilities, so you can freely find all of them on your very first visit to each world. Even the act of finding them is a fun experience as the hiding places are really creative and take full advantage of a world's atmosphere. With the hidden Mickey hunt combined with ingredient hunting for meals, the game greatly rewards the player for exploring as you get really good benefits and worthwhile rewards for the time you spend on these quests. There's also Rage Form, which is a huge improvement over Anti-Form as you have control over when it activates and you get a lot of benefits from using it. It has a much better moveset with combos that are less stagnant and a risk ability that allows you to increase your combo capacity in exchange for health. Other features include fast travel between save points so you don't have to constantly go back and forth between the gummy ship, an updated party member system that allows you to have all your teammates on the field at once, mech combat with 3 distinct types of robots with different attributes to control, and a cheat mode that allows you to customize the game's difficulty to your liking. You can use easy codes to one-shot enemies, which can be really useful for speedrunning and item grinding, or pro codes if you want to challenge yourself. This game also has the benefit of having the absolute best gummy ship mode to date. Instead of just reducing it to a shooting gallery, they gave the gummy ship its own free world for you to explore. You have full control over the ship and can navigate entire star systems at your own pace. You can collect money, destroy asteroids to obtain minerals, hunt for treasure, go through vortexes to increase your travel speed, and even take pictures of constellations. The level of detail they put into this part of the game is incredible, and it makes for a really fun side attraction while traveling to new worlds. The worlds themselves are also really fun. Well, not all of them, but that's for later. The fields you venture through are large and expansive, with more open space for travel and combat than ever before. They're made to compensate the large groups of enemies you encounter, and they never feel overcrowded or cluttered. There's a lot of space for you to maneuver around so you can base a strategy on your surroundings more clearly. And not only are they big, they're also beautifully designed. Not just graphically, but for the amount of detail they put in each one. Each world has unique gimmicks and visual aesthetics that do a great job in capturing the spirit of the movies they're based on. The lush plant life of Tangled, the open seas of the Caribbean, the technological marvel of San Francisco, the factory aesthetic of Monsters Inc., Andy's room in the toy box. Even Olympus is made into a fully explorable world instead of just a Coliseum arena. Every world feels different in some way, so you always get the feeling that you're going somewhere new. Finally, there's the Remind DLC that acts as additional content akin to the Final Mix versions of 1 and 2. It provides you with all the stuff that you'd expect. A story expansion, more boss fights, a new world to explore, but the best thing about it is how it gives you the ability to play as different characters, including Roxas and Kairi. The gameplay of these two in particular is phenomenal, with so much fluidity and stunning visuals complementing their movesets. Roxas plays like you're actually in control of the boss fight from 2.5, and Kairi has an extensive moveset that allows her to play differently from Sora while still feeling unique. If this game had some kind of mode that allowed you to replay the whole game as them, it would have been completely set. They're just such an amazing addition to the game. And now, for the stuff that really sucks about this game.
This might be a good spot to find some ingredients. This might be a good spot to find some ingredients. This might be a good spot to find some ingredients. This might be a good spot to find some ingredients. This might be a good spot to find some ingredients. This might be a good spot to find some ingredients.
I know this doesn't relate to anything story or gameplay wise, but the constant inescapable dialogue that plays every single time you go into an area with ingredients is insufferable. Aside from the line delivery being awkward, it's unbearably repetitive as there's no way to disable it. Every time this dialogue came up, I wanted to destroy the speakers on my television set just to escape this torture. It is so tiresome to hear them say the exact same lines in the exact same way, in the exact same speed, in the exact same tone, and it always comes up when you least expect it, so you can't even mute the TV ahead of time to escape it. Half the time I actually dreaded playing through this game because I knew that at some point this stupid dialogue was going to pop back up. The upteenth time that I heard this, I thought my eardrums were going to implode from the stress of listening to it over and over. I would honest to God rather listen to Sittin' on the Toilet on continual loop than subject myself to this cringe dialogue even one more time. It is that painful. Okay, now that I got that out of the way, let's move on to the game's other problems. The story, for starters, is absolutely terrible. It has by far the absolute worst pacing in the entire series in terms of how much pointless filler it has, with nothing important happening for like 70% of the game. Cutscenes go on for way too long with a lot of awkward pauses and really badly delivered lines. And the Disney worlds have practically no point of being here because of how little they contribute to the plot. Half of them are literally shot-for-shot repeats of the stories of the original movie. Like, dead serious. Shot-for-shot repeat of the original movie. Yeah, it was cool at first, but now it's just unbearable. I don't care how much detail they put into these cutscenes, they're a boring slog to sit through. Not to mention they end up being worthless anyway since the power of waking is pulled straight out of Sora's ass. KH1 and 2 gave Sora a clear reason for exploring each world. KH1 was about sealing keyholes to slow down the Heartless invasion. KH2 was about searching for Riku and the organization. This game, half the time I forgot there was even a plot going on because they do so little to address the actual story. Apparently they were traveling to different worlds in search of the power of waking, but Ventus tells Sora that he had it all along, making all the time we spent in each Disney location completely pointless. And then you have the completely pointless subplot with Pete and Maleficent that went absolutely nowhere. Every scene with them appearing on screen is a boring waste of time as it amounts to more padding and teasing for the next game. And that's another problem. Instead of focusing on wrapping up its own story, KH3 is far more concerned with setting up the next one. There's far too much KH4 teasing in this game when it's supposed to be about defeating Xehanort. Like, seriously, what was the point of having these two appear every single hour if they have no influence on the main plot? You could easily cut them out and it would change nothing. And after completing the last Disney World, everything happens at fast forward. The Keyblade War, the return of missing characters, that bullshit with Kairi being turned into a plot device for the 20th time. They didn't even let Roxas and Ventus have a proper exchange. The most anticipated character interaction in the last 9 years, and there's no payoff for it. And because of how horribly the story is paced, the emotional moments don't properly stick like they're supposed to. Stuff like Axel and Saïx talking on the clock tower, Terra reuniting with Ventus and Aqua, Riku's replica finding peace after finishing his promise to Naminé. We can't fully appreciate the emotional impact of these scenes because there was no proper build-up to any of it. I actually found myself skipping the cutscenes half the time because they were so uneventful and needlessly dragged out. And that's a horrible way for people to look at this story because it's supposed to be the payoff for all the time we invested in the Xehanort saga. And aside from the story, there's a long list of gameplay features that are just terrible. The most infamous one being attraction flows. These things are such an annoyance as they constantly disrupt the flow of gameplay. Using them feels cheap as they take away from the challenge by easily one-shotting enemies, and several of them don't even have good mechanics. They're just terrible to control. Also, where did this stupid ability even come from? They just give Sora the ability to summon Disney rights flat out of nowhere and they never explain this power. It's completely bizarre. I am so glad Critical Mode gives you the option to turn this off outright because they are just a pointless addition to the gameplay, outside of being incredibly annoying. Links are also pretty bad too, as they just seem to have the same behavior as attraction flows. Summons in previous games were fun because they added to the combat while not turning it into a cheap gimmick. They felt like actual party members you fought alongside with, and they had interesting methods for interacting with Sora. Links in this game don't have anything separating them from each other as they all amount to the same functionality. Summon a Disney character, deal lots of damage, that's it. It makes Links a pointless addition because choosing between different summons doesn't make a difference. You get the same result no matter which one you're using, and it just feels like they watered down the way Sora interacts with them, making them into generic super moves that just feel like an exploit for people who didn't bother to learn how to play the game right. Team attacks are also a downgrade as they turn the conditions for using them into a stupid RNG thing. Unlike KH2, where you could use them as long as you had MP, team attacks in this game pop up randomly. You have to stand around and wait for the game to randomly give them to you, which by then you won't even need them because you're already in the process of finishing a fight. The only way to get past this is by using the team effort ability, which cost a whopping 50 AP to even use. Who the hell thought this was a good idea? None of your guest party members are even going to get that much AP by the end game. It's complete bullshit. Wall running is a clunky addition that wasn't fully realized, as Sora tends to stagger when trying to move in certain directions, which isn't fun when you have to fight enemies sticking to walls. The ship combat in the pirate world is horrible, with extremely slow mechanics that aren't fun to engage with. And what makes it even worse is that it takes up the majority of the level, practically having the world built around this terrible system. Boss battles drag out for way too long, demanding that you spend time collecting crabs in order to level grind your ship. And the control you have over the ship is painfully sluggish with bad aiming that feels like you're not properly hitting anything. While the world itself is fun to explore, the ship battles are a horrible addition that take enjoyment away from it. There's also a really shitty gimmick where you slide around on Goofy's shield, with terrible controls and a camera that fails to properly keep up with your movements. And they make this shitty mechanic mandatory, with several segments forcing it on you with no way of skipping them. Not to mention the horrible flan minigames that you need to do to gain access to ingredients for food and the ultimate weapon. Half of them are boring and generic, the other half are infuriating with horrendous controls and mechanics tied to them, including the aforementioned shield sliding. These minigames outright punish you for mechanics that don't properly work, and it makes the act of obtaining the ultimate weapon an abhorrent chore. Another problem with this game is how it pretty much throws everything at you in the very first world. Wasn't it a plot point that Sora lost most of his power after the events of Triple D? Now all of a sudden he's summoning theme park rides, activating form changes, using powerful shot locks, flying through the air, performing flow motion. What is even happening? They just give away all of Sora's abilities like candy, making him too OP at the start of the game. It takes away from the experience by turning the opening level into a giant cluster of ridiculous stuff with no limitations. Instead of unlocking new abilities over time like in KH1 and 2, which gave you the feeling of growing powerful over time, you already start off powerful. It takes away that feeling of progression previous games gave you by throwing everything at you at one time. Obtaining powers and abilities in previous games was rewarding because there was a sense of accomplishment to getting them after defeating a certain boss or completing a certain quest. In KH3, all of the powers and abilities you obtain are tied to the game's opening tutorial, so you accomplish nothing by obtaining them since you're expected to get them off the bat. It's cheap and lazy, and it makes the rest of the game feel linear in terms of character growth. There's also an issue with some of the worlds being downright awful. For starters, the Winnie the Pooh world is completely and utterly butchered. In KH1 and 2, you got the sensation that you were actually exploring the 100-acre wood, going to all sorts of places by moving to different parts of the book, visiting locations faithfully adapted from the movies, interacting with the entire cast of characters, playing a variety of minigames with different mechanics. It was a lot of fun. It acted as a lighthearted break from the action RPG aspect of the game by giving you a world driven purely by character interaction, exploration, and relaxing atmosphere. It wasn't always perfect, but it was a charming portion of the game that really captured that sense of childhood you got simply from spending time with these characters. Kingdom Hearts 3 throws all of this away in service of a terrible minigame that forces you to do the exact same thing 3 times in a row. It just amounts to a shitty version of Bust a Move where you mix and match fruits and vegetables with no variety between the 3 times you do it. It's boring and repetitive, especially as the game forces you to sit through the same tutorial every single time you start it up. Why do I need another reminder of how to play this minigame? I just did it 3 minutes ago. The exploration aspect is completely removed, giving you only one location to play in, and the large cast of characters isn't even present. They throw in like one new character from the movie that no one remembers. Seriously, did anyone actually watch this thing? And the storyline doesn't even have a conflict to resolve. You just talk to a small handful of characters about gardening, and that's it. It's an entirely 100% pointless addition to the game that feels like it was only put in there out of obligation. After the incredible amount of detail this world was given in previous games, it's actually kind of insulting how little they cared about it here. Arendelle is another downright horrible level, with so much repetitive backtracking mixed with terrible minigames and padding. Seriously, who came up with that stupid Olaf search quest? What was the point? What was the purpose of this part of the game? It doesn't further the story, it's not entertaining, and the dialogue that plays on loop while looking for him just reminds me of... And it's actually worse than the 100-acre wood because as where that level was optional, this one is not. You are forced to play through this torture every single time you start a new playthrough. I cannot begin to describe the dread I feel starting a new game knowing I would eventually have to come back here. It's the worst aspects of Deep Jungle multiplied by tenfold with no interesting visuals or atmosphere to accompany it. It's just snow and ice for a solid 2 hours. Lastly, there's this final world segment that's just really obnoxious. It starts with this really forced low point moment in the story where Sora and friends are suddenly rendered powerless despite that they just defeated an entire army of heartless nobodies and unversed. Then you have to go through this confusing afterlife segment where you have to collect 300 Soras. It's a boring time waster with horrible platforming to boot. Then you have this annoying segment where you have to fight the same boss 7 times in a row. Then you have one of the cutscenes playing out exactly the same. Then you fight the Demon Tide for the 5th time. Then you have this random out of nowhere scene where the Keyblade warriors of the past suddenly show up to help out. And don't even get me started on that bullshit they pulled with Terra's lingering will, where he shows up for a total of 2 minutes of screen time before completely disappearing from the plot. But by far, the worst thing about Kingdom Hearts 3 is how completely broken the guard system is. And I don't mean broken like spam it like Aqua's cartwheel and you gain invincibility. I mean broken like it does not fucking work like it's supposed to. The invincibility frames are horrible as they don't provide proper protection from attacks, and it doesn't even properly deflect attacks, resulting in unfair damage. Half the time, the hitbox completely disappears, resulting in you getting hit despite that you clearly had your Keyblade in front of the incoming attack. The guard system is something that's supposed to help you out in a game based on reaction time and strategy. It's what made boss battles in KH2 engaging because there was a pattern to when you had to act defensively. It helped to make combat more interesting as there was a tool you could use to protect yourself from damage and reward you with a counterattack for good timing. But because of how unresponsive the guard system is in KH3, it takes all of this away. In a game that relies on your ability to react to certain things, it's a completely unreliable tool. This is made even worse in boss fights like the Data Battles and Yozora fight where a single combo will either stun-lock you for high damage or kill you outright. It's a load of bullshit that nearly ruins the entire experience. Even KH1 had a more reliable guard system. At least it had a more consistent hitbox. The fact that they never took the time to fix this problem with any sort of update patch makes it so frustrating considering how easy it would be to just fix this. It's a total mess that greatly interferes with the way you engage with the game. So with all that said, I honestly feel really conflicted with this game. I rank it as the second best entry in the series, but given all the problems I went over, it doesn't really feel like it. The badly paced story, the underwhelming payoff for years of plot development, the terrible minigames, the obnoxious padding, the waste of hardware that was 100 Acre Wood and Arendelle, the shitty gimmicks like shield sliding and pirate ship combat, the boring links and attraction flows, the unreliable RNG for team attacks, the horrible platforming in the final world, the way the game gives you access to all your stuff before the end of the first level, the god-awful guard system. It's a huge mess of problems that can't be overlooked. And the reason for that confliction is that in spite of all these problems, it's still not a bad game. When compared to many other entries in the series, it's still very well designed with notable improvements and enhancements. It feels like it had the potential to be the best in the series, but muddied its opportunity with so many bad decisions. It's frustrating that there are so many things holding KH3 back because it really does have some of the best stuff out of all the Kingdom Hearts games. The air stepping is great. The form changes are great. The dozens of different playstyles and weapon combinations is great. The updates to magic spells is great. The gummy ship mode is great. The data battles are great. Playing as Roxas and Kairi is great. The cuisine bonuses are great. The hidden Mickey hunt is great. The easy codes and pro codes are great. That last fight with Xehanort is just freaking fantastic. I do still feel like this game could have been a lot more than what we got, but what it gave us is still a pretty fun experience. And hopefully Square will learn from the problems of this game to make Kingdom Hearts 4 the next best game in the series. It's far from perfect, but it's still a pretty cool ride.
Sora. You're lucky. Looks like my summer vacation is over.
Yeah, I know, really predictable choice for the #1 spot. But throughout all the time I spent with this franchise, no entry in the series has yet to recapture the magic and wonder that this game did. Kingdom Hearts 2 is everything that you could possibly want from a sequel to KH1 and so much more. It takes all the elements people loved about the original and expands upon them tenfold. More shortcut options, more abilities, more combo modifiers, better minigames, a bigger and better gummy ship mode, improved camera controls, and this is only the tip of the iceberg. This game has so much to talk about that it's impossible to go over everything in an isolated segment of a worst to best list. But I'll do my best to go over the most iconic elements that everyone loves about it. The most prominent one being the combat. The combat in this game is phenomenal, almost to the point that it's unbelievable that this is a sequel to KH1. Not only did they make improvements while fixing past issues, but they added so much new content that the experimentation options are practically limitless. Everything about it feels faster than before, allowing you to dish out combos a lot quicker and deal damage at a breakneck pace. But it's not just faster, it's also tighter and smoother. All of Sora's movements have such a majestic weight to them that you really feel like you're swinging his keyblade around. The force and impact of every attack feels satisfying and authentic, making the combat feel so much more addicting than the first game. The combos that Sora can pull off are much more in-depth than ever before, with even more modifiers and branching paths for different combinations. It makes the game less of a button masher as it adds a satisfying sense of decision making with each attack and modifier having a unique use, which can help you plan different strategies and drastically change your approach to combat. Instead of simply making everything tied to the X button, the combo modifiers and new attacks are assigned to different buttons. This adds a layer of timing and careful planning to your combos as you have to decide which button you're going to press, which combo modifiers you want to use, how you want to end a combo. It takes the simplistic nature of the first game and gives it a much more complex feel, like a true successor to what we previously got. There's also a number of features that greatly improve the pace of the gameplay with real thought of the previous game's flaws taken into account. You can now assign items to your shortcuts instead of just magic spells. You can open chest during combat instead of having to wait until you defeat all the enemies in an area. You can switch party members while on the field and even in the pause menu instead of only being able to do it at a save point. Your counterattack is faster and more responsive than it was in the first game, making it a much more reliable tool. Sora's attacks have a much wider range and flexibility to them, allowing him to properly engage with aerial enemies he previously couldn't fight properly. They're also less stiff, with no troubling lags allowing him to move quickly out of danger instead of being left open. Even the field of view, which was a huge problem in the first game, is completely fixed. The camera is set a lot further back, giving you a much better scope of battlefields and enemies. It allows you to more properly detect oncoming attacks and analyze your situation so you can better plan your strategies in a tense situation. The guard system is improved and made much more reliable. It activates more quickly with better iframes and can properly block attacks from multiple directions. It also plays into a crucial element of the combat, where you have to carefully consider the timing of your actions, taking notice of an enemy's movements to know when it's the right time to press the square button, and getting the timing right can net you a really rewarding advantage in combat, with counters, reaction commands, and even stun locks. And not only are there so many improvements over the first game, but there's so many new tools and options given to you throughout. Dry forms, summons, magic spells, launchers, team attacks, reaction commands, all of which have a proper use in every combat situation. Launchers can be activated in the middle or end of a combo, allowing Sora to knock enemies into the air to juggle them. Not only is this a great offensive tactic, but it also works defensively. It lets Sora focus on a single enemy while moving away from ground level, to safely distance himself from other enemies while focusing on a single target. Team attacks offer a unique way for party members to engage in battle, performing a joint attack with Sora to attack groups of enemies in one fell swoop. Not only do they provide a great defensive edge, but they're also a lot of fun to use. Each party member's limit behaves differently, offering something new with every party member you come across. It helps to make the characters you team up with feel more unique and involved in battle, giving them a much bigger role in combat than just providing support or additional healing items. Summons are also greatly expanded on, with each one having a unique gimmick with useful benefits. They can provide crowd control, restore your MP, heal you, and behave independently from Sora, making them feel like bonus party members instead of just generic summons. They all have variety and distinct purposes in battle, with so many different uses depending on your playstyle. Magic spells return with far more flexibility than the first game, with each one having a different behavior and strategic use in battle. They can be used as projectiles, spinning attacks for crowd control, launching enemies into the air, and even reflect damage while providing you with a barrier of invincibility. There's so many different ways spells can be used both offensively and defensively, giving them a greater sense of utility. There's also reaction commands, which are easily one of the best additions to the series by far, adding a cinematic edge to battle with so many different ways for Sora to interact with enemies. It's a really satisfying reward for those who can properly recognize and time them, allowing Sora to turn their powers against them in a fun way. They fit properly into the core gameplay, giving you another method for attacking enemies while rewarding those who play more defensively. But the biggest addition is easily the introduction of drive forms, allowing Sora to absorb party members to activate special forms that prioritize in different techniques. There is so much experimentation that can be done with these forms, taking the possibilities of combat to an entirely new level. Forms that specialize in quick physical combos, forms that allow you to use magic in creative ways, forms that alter the properties of both Keyblade and magic-based techniques. Each one feels distinct from each other, giving you the sense that you're always doing something different, and the burst in power they provide is so satisfying that it makes them a great tool to practice with. KH2 provides you with so many different options that didn't exist previously, creating so many different ways to approach every combat scenario. But unlike KH3, it doesn't give you too much at one time. All of the new abilities are properly spaced out throughout the story, so you're given new tools at just the right time. To make up for getting assets progressively instead of all at once, the game gives each tool a unique function that can help you out in different ways, allowing you to switch up the pace of the combat to your liking very early on. Not only do you have a huge arsenal, but the game allows you to freely weave in and out of different abilities and techniques, letting you quickly switch between tactics. And the transition between different abilities is so smooth and responsive that it makes you want to switch between different tactics instead of just spamming basic combos. Transitions between ground attacks and aerial attacks, transitions between magic spells and physical attacks, transitions between combo finishers and team attacks. It's so much fun comboing different abilities into each other because of how in sync it is with the faster pace of the gameplay. And since the game allows you to zip in and out of them freely, it adds an extra layer of depth to combat by providing you with so many different choices. They also added a new feature that makes obtaining abilities more interesting, allowing you to unlock combo modifiers and support abilities by completing certain checkpoints in the story instead of level grinding. It feels much more natural than having to spend extra hours grinding for them like you had to in KH1, and it makes winning a boss battle so much more rewarding by obtaining these as a prize. You'd probably think all this stuff would make Sora an unstoppable force, but fortunately, the game is built in a way that challenges you very carefully. KH2 offers a huge and healthy variety of enemies, each with unique designs and behaviors in battle. Every heartless and nobody you come across encourages you to fight them in different ways, experimenting with different strategies and tactics to survive. You can find yourself dying really quickly if you just mash the X button, especially on higher difficulties. Memorizing enemy behaviors and knowing how to exploit their weaknesses is crucial to making combat more complex and thought-provoking as opposed to a brainless button masher. Every enemy encounter feels fair, with the right number of enemies and enemy types to challenge your skill level. The combat is designed in a way that requires you to carefully consider how you're going to fight, which techniques to use, which enemies to prioritize, when it's the right time to strike, and even which abilities you equip for each encounter. Instead of just blindly equipping every ability available for Sora to use, you have to really think about your ability layout for certain fights. Some abilities can end up being a detriment by slowing down your combos or leaving you open, so you have to know what each ability does, how it operates, and which ones to leave out to make a certain fight easier. The game's difficulty feels properly balanced around Sora's new capabilities and increased mobility, making for a methodical system where you have to practice different strategies to make the most out of Sora's new moveset and arsenal. It's a combat system that's fun to learn because there's so much to explore, and because the mechanics behind it are built around utilizing and planning different strategies, it makes it more accessible for different people. It feels different with all of its improvements and additions while still making it feel familiar to the roots of the first game, making it a proper successor to the previous system. They even added a number of new gimmicks that worked out pretty well. The Pride Lands is a really fun level where you take control over Lion Sora with his own unique combo modifiers and mechanics. While it does have the issue of removing options like Atlantica and Neverland from KH1, it makes up for it by giving Lion Sora his own unique abilities for fighting enemies. Launchers, mid-combo techniques you can use with a square button, a dash ability that allows him to move faster, a dash tackle that allows you to transition from running into a wide spinning attack, and a combo finisher with a wide AoE effect. He's quick, nimble, and really flexible, allowing him to make all sorts of fast maneuvers in the heat of battle. Lion Sora is so much more satisfying than Mermaid Sora because of how much more freedom it gives you. His attacks are faster and his movements aren't slowed down by the terrible swimming controls Atlantica forced on you. And as an added bonus, they give you the ability to play as King Mickey during select boss fights. Not only is this a fantastic Easter egg for those who can find it, but playing as Mickey is also fun in its own way. His movements and controls are slick and smooth, with unique abilities and mobility you can use to make up for his lack of defensive options. You can even choose to play entire boss fights as him with enough skill, making for a really fun detour from playing as Sora. There is so much flavor put into KH2's combat that this alone would make it the best in the series. With expanded movesets, new magic spells, and a more in-depth approach to battle, Kingdom Hearts 2's combat is truly a sight to behold. There's so much complexity and thought put into it that it still amazes me that they improved upon the first game as much as they did. It's simply an amazing system that only gets better and better every time I revisit it. Of course, it's not just the combat that's largely improved over the first game. The Gummy Ship mode is so much more fun, made into a fantastic shooting gallery minigame instead of just a generic point A to point B feature for traveling in between worlds. Each course is visually dazzling with fantastic music to accompany the gameplay. They all have a unique pace to them and different challenges to separate them from each other, giving you something new to do every time you engage with a course. It really gives you the sensation that you're traveling across space, with courses that are fun to look at with a unique aesthetic to each one. The Gummy Ship mode is simply a huge improvement over the one from the first game, with more energy and visual variety to make the detour in between worlds a fun activity you actually want to engage in instead of it being forced on you. The level design is also improved over the first game. They completely remove the horrible platforming and just allow you to freely travel across areas at an even pace. Not only are they faithfully designed after the aesthetic of the Disney movies, but they're also brilliantly made with the refurbished combat in mind. Areas are wide with a ton of open space, allowing you to make the most out of Sora's increased mobility and arsenal. They managed to present a good scope of the battles, giving you room to properly maneuver and plan out how you engage with enemies. And they still have a sense of exploration with background elements you can interact with and chests you can search for to gain additional items. The item synthesis system, which was a huge point of content in the first game, is improved upon and fixed in so many ways. There is still the tedium of killing the same enemies over and over again for the RNG-based chance of them actually dropping the synthesis item you need, but the game provides you with a set of tools to make item synthesizing drastically less time-consuming than it was in the first game. It introduces a leveling system where you gain experience from creating items, which allows you to cut the required items needed for synthesizing in half. You even gain access to using special items that cut down the required number for synthesizing items even further. And instead of restricting when Sora is allowed to get the ultimate weapon behind having to complete different recipes, you can obtain the right to synthesize it as soon as you get the required recipe and items. The rate in which you can obtain the ultimate weapon is so much quicker and less stressful than it was in the first game. Like, you don't even have to fully level up the synthesis system to obtain it. With the ability to drastically decrease the number of items needed to obtain items, while also removing restrictions that were set in the first game, item synthesizing is made into a much more accessible feature. The Winnie the Pooh world is also highly improved upon, with more areas to explore, more characters to interact with, and minigames that are actually fun to play instead of annoying and badly designed. And the cream of the crop is how KH2 has the best ratio of good to bad boss fights out of any game in the series. There's a large number of them with a healthy variety between each one. All of them are built around Sora's enhanced capabilities, providing interesting challenges, with learning curves, recognizable attack patterns, and possible openings for the player to learn. Knowing when to guard and when to dodge while paying close attention to their movements makes them really engaging battles where you can't simply spam the attack button to win. There are badly designed bosses like in every game, but when compared to other entries in the series, they're a lot fewer and far between. They manage to be challenging without being unfair, providing you with battles that test what you've been learning throughout the course of the game. They're also a lot more active than the boss fights in KH1, with an improved pace and overall better flow. And nowhere is this more apparent than the single best boss fight in the entire series, the battle with Roxas after Axel's death. This battle acts as the crown jewel of what people love about KH2's refurbished combat, with a fight that acts as a strong spotlight both story-wise and mechanically. You see Roxas desperately trying to claim his independence from Sora while lashing out at him for indirectly ruining his life, doing everything he can to break free from the fate forced on him. His patterns are rebellious and fitting his determination and newfound rage. He attacks with a lot of aggression, but also in a way that lets you read his movements. Out of all the boss fights in the game, this one has the most emotional weight to it while also providing the best sense of balance. It's a proper one-on-one fight between Sora and his other half, with Roxas coming to terms with his relationship with Sora and accepting him as a part of who he is. And it serves as a satisfying sample of Kingdom Hearts 2's final strength, its story. Now, a lot of people have criticized KH2's story for losing sight of the focus and consistent nature of the first game. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't see that. Unlike the first game where each world had a purpose and meaningful connection with the overall plot, the worlds in KH2 are more or less filler that only loosely ties into the main story. There is the sense that Sora is fighting the organization and searching for a way into their stronghold, while looking for Riku, who disappeared after the events of the first game. But for the most part, nothing that happens in any of the Disney worlds has any significant role in forwarding the main plot. The stuff regarding the fight against the organization or the search for Riku isn't made into the vocal point of the storylines, nor is it specifically what they're about. Some of them amount to generic retellings of the stories of the original movies, and even the ones with more original storylines don't really do much to contribute to the main story or growth of the characters. The only Disney world that does anything to forward the plot is Beast Castle, and that's only because it's the only world where you fight and kill an organization member. The rest are sort of just there as a means to capitalize on the Disney aspect of the franchise. It makes the padding and development of the main story feel slow and padded out. Not as bad as KH3, but still noticeably fillerish. So why does the story of KH2 act as one of its strengths in spite of these problems? Well, simply because it stays faithful to the roots of the story set up in the first game. The portrayal of its large cast of characters is faithful to how they were before, and it expands on the main cast in a lot of good ways. Sora, for example, is still as pure and likable as in the first game with some new additions to his development. He's still a fun-loving kid going on adventures across different worlds, maintaining a reasonable level-headed attitude while getting into mischief. The game actually expands upon his character in the sense of how he built his strength by forming bonds with different people, learning about how teamwork and friendship can make a person stronger. He forms new bonds with new characters while expanding on the ones he made in the first game. It's a great mix of both old and new relationships as they help forward Sora's growth as a person. Goofy is given more personality as the smart one of the trio, even giving him some of the most insightful dialogue in the game. It really feels like they put more time into giving him more characteristics than just being a clumsy oaf, making him one of the most well-written characters in the game. It even expands on Riku's character, a person trying to redeem themselves for their past mistakes while helping their friends from the shadows. A person who walked away from those he hurt to right his wrongs, seeking forgiveness and struggling to accept himself. He tries to convince himself he's okay when in reality he's still hurting. But in spite of that hurt, he still pushes himself forward to help Sora on his mission. It leads up to a fantastic culmination and conclusion for his redemption arc, putting aside his past rivalry with Sora and working alongside him to correct his mistake. Even Final Fantasy characters are given a better presence than in the first game, with new characters while expanding on returning ones. It's impressive how this game manages to have a huge cast of characters without feeling overcrowded. There's also updated presentation in the cutscenes, with more lively body language and facial expressions. It makes them more fun to watch as there's a much better range of emotion. What ultimately makes KH2's story fun in spite of its drawbacks is how it just feels like a much grander story than the first game. The stakes feel properly elevated with new villains and more worlds to explore. Characters have similar goals, but with some new additions to prevent them from being rehashes of what we saw before. The game doesn't just simply build upon the first one's popularity. It acts as a proper continuation of Sora's story. You feel like you're engaging in the next chapter of a larger tale, with character development continued over from the first. And even though there are Disney worlds with plots based on the movie, Sora has a direct influence on how those stories play out. It makes worlds like Land of Dragons and the Pride Lands fun to play through because there's an added spin on how the plot plays out, unlike KH3 where Sora just stood in the background doing nothing. But I think the one thing everyone loves about this game is how brilliantly it handles Roxas. People tend to criticize the first 3 hours for being a needlessly dragged out tutorial, but what makes it work so well is how it entices us to Roxas as a character. It shows him just trying to live a normal life he believes to be real alongside his friends. We see him just going by his day-to-day activities while trying to be happy in spite of the weird stuff going on around him. And as he begins to unravel the facade that was placed on him, his story begins to take a really tragic turn. He just wants to go back to living a normal life, and now he's being told by all these people that his existence was an accident and he needs to sacrifice himself for someone he barely knows. And seeing him ultimately come to terms with his fate and accepting his loss at the end is a real gut punch. Not only does this serve as a good mini-story that ties into the main plot, but it demonstrates why Roxas is an important character. It demonstrates the legitimate struggles that a nobody like Roxas has to suffer through, seeking a life that gives them purpose in spite of their presence being a looming empty shell. Wanting to feel something that gives them that sense of humanity that they lost. And with the knowledge of the friendship he built and lost with Axel during the events of Days, it makes the prologue even more bittersweet. It's a prologue that shows how Roxas is not a nobody. He's an independent person with emotions and feelings. A tragic figure forced to play a sacrificial role. He fights and struggles so desperately to cling to his right to exist, his identity, and his independence. But in the end, he comes to understand that he belongs with Sora and willingly joins with him. It creates a perfect juxtaposition in tone that closes off the prologue and starts the real journey, where Roxas reaches a bittersweet end while Sora has an uplifting new start. He finally accepts Sora and his duality with him, laying down his arms and allowing Sora to be his vessel. He accepts Sora as his purpose and his home. Roxas's story is a real emotional ride when you put it in perspective, noticing all the things that make it more bittersweet and meaningful as the tale of a person who just wanted to be, but he couldn't because his fate was tied to another person, a fate he didn't ask for but nonetheless accepted. And it's writing like this that makes Kingdom Hearts 2's story so beloved years later. In spite of the convoluted stupidity going on everywhere else, it treats its characters with the utmost respect with a profound understanding of why people grew to love them so much. Their struggles are believable, their journey is satisfying to see unfold, and the lessons they learn about friendship and bonds feels genuine. And it all leads up to what is easily the best ending in a Kingdom Hearts game. Sora and Riku putting aside their differences, watching them become brothers while having that heart-to-heart on the shore, sitting there quietly with the sound of the waves soothing the audience, and the silence is broken by Kairi's message to Sora, and after reading it, the door to light appears and guides the two back to Destiny Islands. And after all our heroes have been through, after all the hardships and struggles, they finally completed their mission. Donald and Goofy found King Mickey, Sora found his friends, and Sora along with Riku and Kairi are finally home where they belong. And Roxas and Naminé have finally become whole people like they always wanted. I know it's a really cheesy thing to say, but this really feels like it could have been the end of the series. Out of all the endings in the series, this one is the most satisfying and fulfilling as it ends on a conclusive note while wrapping up all the loose ends that matter to the main characters. It's an ending that fills you with so much happiness, because everything about it feels completely deserved. Kingdom Hearts 2 is easily the apex of the series, expanding on the first game in every aspect you would expect a sequel to do so. Its massive amount of content really pushes the limit of what the PS2 software was capable of, and it never loses sight of what made people become fans of the series with the original game. Playing through Kingdom Hearts 2 is simply a magical experience, offering so much innovation that isn't available in any other entry in the series. It's a fantastic experience from beginning to end, and is without question the absolute best Kingdom Hearts game. Thanks for checking out my review. If you liked what you saw here and would like to support me, check out my Patreon in the description. Every little bit helps and I always appreciate those who support my work. Until next time, stay cool.